is Professor Seumas Miller. Is that right?
That's
Seumas Miller.
right on.
And he will be he will be talking about joint political rights and obligations. There will be 45 minutes for the presentation and then 15 for the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, so how's the volume? Is that good? Well, thanks very much for to the organisers for inviting me, and I should also thank those of you who are here after this this long and arduous day. If I see someone sleeping, I will assume that they accept what I'm saying and needn't hear anymore. So I'm going to talk about these joint political rights and obligations. I should say the perspective that I come from is probably a little different from some of the folk here in a couple of different respects. First of all, I'm not a fan of group minds and such, preferring a rather more restricted menu of ontological entities. And on the other hand, I'm certainly not a fan of what I call aggregate individualism or atomism. So I don't like this this tainted term that sometimes people have tried to foist upon me of being a singularist. I see myself as an individual relationalist. So there are individual human beings and the relations between them, which is what we need to focus on in the area of social action. On the other hand, I think the issue of the reducibility of collective entities is quite different, and collective entities clearly aren't reducible to individual human beings or their relations, but that says nothing about the notion of a group mind, which I think is just a rather bad error. Anyway, whatever one thinks about all of that, what I'm going to do here is just pursue my own little project, which is to try to use the notion of joint action, try and extend it, an individualist account of joint action, try and extend it in a whole range of different ways, and in that context I've offered analyses of regularities in joint action, which are roughly conventions, layered structures of joint action, which I think are serviceable as a first step to understanding what happens in organisations, joint mechanisms, which essentially have inputs where the result is not predictable or not known or some such, but nevertheless the mechanism is committed to by those making use of it. And I think that's serviceable for understanding a whole lot of social mechanisms such as voting, benchmark manipulation, financial benchmarks I talked about in another conference. But what I want to do here today is further this project of mine in another way, in a kind of normative, in its normative aspect, and basically offer you a story about what I'll refer to as joint rights and joint obligations, and distinguish these from individual rights and obligations, and then look at the application of this notion in the political sphere. The sources for this I've got up there, for those of you who are entirely devoid of anything else to read over the next few months. I've been running this line about joint rights for some time in all of those works, but I guess the notion has evolved a little bit over the years. And let's hope, well, I'm still hoping that it'll get some sort of traction. Okay, so let's just get a few different distinctions on the table. Some moral rights appear to be logically prior to institutions. They appear to be rights that are based essentially on properties that we have as human beings and kind of independent of our institutional and indeed our social lives. Perhaps the right to life, the right not to be tortured, and so on. If we call those natural rights, then some of the long list of so-called human rights would be natural rights. Nevertheless, there look to be many rights on the UN's list of so-called human rights that are not natural rights in that sense, because they're rights that depend logically on social institutions. I mean, the right to vote depends on a system of voting, the right to a fair trial depends on a particular institutional arrangement, and so on and so forth. So there are a bunch of moral rights that presuppose institutions, so let's call those institutional rights. A further distinction within institutional moral rights is what I'll refer to as general institutional moral rights. And these depend in part on properties we possess as human beings, as ordinary human beings, and in part on membership of a community with social institutions of the relevant kind. So general institutional moral rights and duties attach to all members of the nation state, let's say, because they're dependent on institutions to which all of these members participate or have a right to participate. So I'll refer to general institutional moral rights, I'll exemplify such rights as ones like the right to vote, the right to equality under the law, and so on and so forth. However, within the category of institutional moral rights, there's a further, at least one other further species, which I'll refer to as special institutional moral rights. And these are roughly the institutional rights, which are moral rights, which are constitutive of particular institutional roles. So, for example, a police officer may have an institutional right, which is also a moral right, which is quite specific to his or her role, and isn't, as it were, general in the sense in which, say, the right to vote is general. And a feature of these special institutional moral rights is that they derive from collective goods realised by the roles of which they are constituted. So, for example, in the case of the police officer's rights, perhaps the collective good is something like crime reduction or some such. Again, these are not typically regarded as human rights in the UN's Charter. They are institutional moral rights, but yet they're not general institutional moral rights. Okay, so these institutional moral rights, whether they be general or special, are relative to institutions, and so even if we've got police officers that have the same, more or less the same array of rights and duties, which is, I don't think is in fact true, but even if we have that in this nation state, they're fairly similar to the ones in some other nation state. Nevertheless, their precise content, strength, and context of application, for example, in the case of the police officer's jurisdiction, is determined by more specific features of those institutions. And of course, it goes without saying that there are many institutional rights which are just not moral rights. They're just institutional rights, institutional duties, which are not moral rights or duties. Okay, so just want to get these distinctions, general distinctions on the table then. So what we've got moral rights and obligation, and we've got a distinction between natural and institutional. Natural ones that one has by virtue of properties one has as an individual human being, as opposed to membership of a community or members of an institution. Then there's, within institutional moral rights, there's, of course, talking about institutional moral rights as opposed to institutional rights which aren't moral rights. Institutional moral rights and obligations, and moral rights and duties, we've got general versus special. Perhaps the right to vote for the government is general, and the right of the police officer to arrest is special. But in addition, and this is what I want to move on to talk about now, with respect to moral and institutional rights and obligations, we've got individual versus joint. So it's the joint rights and obligations, including but not restricted to joint moral rights and obligations, rights and duties, that I want to spend some time talking about, and I guess I want to get that on the table as a useful theoretical notion that I think can do quite a lot of work. Okay, so as I said, individual right is one possessed wholly in virtue of properties one has as an individual, so perhaps the right to life is such a right. But a joint right is an individual right. Yes, it's a right that an individual person has, but they have jointly with others, and therefore there's an interdependency between these individuals that have that right. The one doesn't have it unless the other has it, so there's interdependence. So let's think of an example. If three persons write a book together, jointly write a book, A, B and C write a book, then let's assume that each has a right to be, say, named as an author of the book jointly with the others, and of course no one else has that right. So it's a joint right that each of those has, but it's not a right that anyone else has. If we move to the sort of macro level, we think of secession. Perhaps secession is a joint right that the members of certain communities have. So maybe the Kurds in Turkey have a right to secession. Maybe they don't, that's controversial. But if we assume that they do, then I suggest that that would be a joint right. It's a right that each Kurd has jointly with the others. But it's not a right that an individual Kurd could have on their own. And equally, it's not a right that anyone else has, that is, non-Kurds don't have that right. Or to take another, possibly even more controversial example in the context of the boat people in Australia being excluded, perhaps Australian citizens have a joint right to exclude others from Australian territory. Whether they're allowed to do so by bribing people smugglers or whatever, I don't know if you've been following the news recently. There's another matter. But at any rate, if they have an exclusion right, it looks like it's a joint right. That is, it's a right that each Australian citizen has with the other Australian citizens, but it's not, they have it interdependently, but it's not one that non-Australians have. Okay, so I hope I've said enough to just suggest to you that there might be something in this concept of a joint right. So let me go on and say a few more things about it. First of all, joint rights, and for that matter joint obligations, are relational individual rights. So they're not just, it's not as if I'm bringing into the sphere of rights some entity above and beyond individual human beings. So there are rights that attach to individuals, human beings in that sense, but nevertheless they're relational. So they're not rights that attach in particular to collective entities per se. Here I'm talking about joint moral rights. There are, of course, rights that do attach to collective entities per se. For example, the legal rights of corporations. Those rights are actually typically individual rights. It's just that the individual in question is a collective entity. And so, in a certain sense, the move to ascribe, the move that I would want to resist, to ascribe moral rights to collective entities, is really just an application of the concept of an individual right. It's just that they've got a different kind of individual, a collective one. Anyway, I'm interested in joint rights, and specifically joint moral rights, and the suggestion that I want to make is, first of all, that they're simply individual rights, but secondly, they're relational individual rights, and in the case of moral rights, they're rights that attach to human beings rather than to collective entities. But of course, it's consistent with that that collective entities have individual legal rights or other institutional rights. So I want to be fairly permissive about institutional rights, but quite restrictive about moral rights. Okay, now I think it's also important to see that joint rights are not merely conditional individual rights. So for example, if I promise that I'll pay you X dollars on condition that you win the race or some such, you have a conditional right to the money, that is, the condition being within the race, but that's not a joint right. And typically, but I'll say a bit more about this, joint rights are relational individual rights, but they're rights to some collective good in a certain sense, if not to the good as in its totality, at least to an aspect of the good or a piece of the good. So if we bake a pie together, perhaps we have a joint right to the pie, or more specifically, to a piece of the pie, at least a piece of the pie, a piece of that pie, the one that we jointly produced. Okay, so the notion of joint rights presupposes the notion of joint action. At least it presupposes, at least many joint rights presuppose the notion of joint action. So what kind of notion of joint action do I want? Well, I want a kind of individualist notion, essentially, and I've gone on about this at great length in other places, so I won't bore you too much here, but roughly speaking, a joint action involves individual actions. Each individual intensely performs their contributory action. Then there's a collective end, which is the end that each of those individuals has. And the important thing about that collective end is A, it's an individual end in the head of each of the individuals, but B, there's interdependence with respect to that end. So there's interdependence with respect to the contributory actions, but there's also interdependence with respect to that end. This is a reductive individualist account, of course, of joint action. This account has a couple of features that make it different from, for example, from I think Margaret Gilbert's account. First of all, joint action, like all action, involves what I'll refer to as weak normativity. This is basically the normativity that attaches to an action if an action can succeed or fails. Intentions, ends, and so on can succeed or fail, and in that sense have normativity in a weak sense. Equally, judgments, beliefs, and the like can be correct or incorrect, true or false, and in that sense have weak normativity. But that doesn't mean that they have normativity in any stronger sense. What's important for my project is that in some cases, joint actions, and in particular the collective ends which are definitive of joint actions, are also collective goods. That is, they are normative. They're not necessarily normative. In some cases they are normative, and that has a lot of implications, particularly implications when it comes to the ascription of joint rights and obligations, because in my view, to joint rights and obligations to some extent based on the fact that the collective ends involved in those joint actions to which people have joint rights and joint obligations are actually collective goods. So you derive, at least in part, the joint right or the joint obligation from the fact that the collective end, if realised, is a collective good. Okay, so let's think a little bit more about that. If we think of many joint actions, they straightforwardly, it seems to me, generate joint rights. So, for example, if there's a joint action which produces a collective good, for example, if we write the book together, or if we manufacture a car together, or whatever the good happens to be, then in the first instance, and other things being equal, we have a right to that good, the thing we produced jointly. But we have a joint right to it. And we have a joint right to it in a number of different ways. We have a joint right perhaps to use it, we may have a joint right to consume it, we may have a joint right to transfer it, and so on and so forth. But that seems like a fairly straightforward notion, and one that's obviously been in play for a long time in relation to, typically though, in relation to the product of one's individual action. Now, in a social context, one way of thinking about the social world of institutions that we live in is that the kind of web of interdependence in the context of a division of labour in respect of the joint production of various collective goods. So police officers perhaps jointly, for want of a better word, produce or maintain or something security. Farmers operating in agribusiness in a market provide an adequate quantum of food. So academics provide, presumably acting jointly, understanding of various matters, And then there's a kind of division of labour where I get a right to some of the food because I, via a market mechanism or some other mechanism, I get a kind of moral right to the food because I've done my bit to generate the understanding. Someone else gets a right to understanding because they've generated food, so on and so forth. So one way to think of a society is simply that there's a kind of web of interdependence. There's a whole lot of people jointly producing goods in particular institutional arrangements, and then there's a kind of division of labour, and that generates rights to things that one didn't directly produce oneself, but nevertheless one contributed by producing the goods that one did contribute, and that entitles one to access goods that may be produced jointly by others. Okay, but so I hope that I've said very briefly, albeit very briefly, enough to convince you that there's something in the notion of a joint right derivative from a collective good, and that this is actually potentially serviceable in a lot of different institutional contexts, including not simply the existence of joint rights, but the existence of joint obligations. Okay, now of course this joint production is not the only, I'm not suggesting this is the only basis for joint rights. Some other more familiar ones perhaps, joint rights such as is the case with individual rights, can just be created by promises. So for example, it may be that we have a joint ownership right in relation to some house because we've entered into a contract with the former owner or some such. So the basis of a joint right could be simply a promise made by some other party. But the particular other basis for joint rights that I want to get on the table at this point is joint rights that are based at least in part, on membership of a social group. And I suggest that the ones I mentioned earlier, such as the right to secession, joint right to secession, joint right to exclusion, are joint rights that are based in part on membership of a particular social group. In that case, the social group that occupies it and is constituent of the nation state, but there could be other social groups. Okay, so let's imagine that a particular members of a social group decide to establish a particular land rights system. There's all sorts of possible land right property regimes, land socialist, more liberal types, and so on. But there's an array of different possibilities. So we might say, well, the members of this community have a joint right to establish or to maintain or to revise or whatever the particular regime, the particular land right system that they have. So that would be a joint right. But as a consequence of that, it may be that, of course, and in fact is the case, that there are multiple then mere individual rights. So Joe has an individual right to own this piece of land within the territory as a consequence of that system once it's established. So in other words, what we have is individual rights which are now dependent on an institutional arrangement which is based on joint rights and obligations. So it may be that there are derivable individual rights from joint rights. It's not necessarily the case that it always goes the other way, though I'll give reasons to suggest that some joint rights at least are based on individual rights. So I'm now talking, having distinguished between joint rights and individual rights, I'm now talking about the possibility of the relationships between them. Joint rights could underpin individual rights. On the other hand, some joint rights could be underpinned by individual rights. Okay, now particular species of joint rights that I think I've argued for in other places is what are often referred in the literature to as collective rights. And I suggest that these so-called collective rights, things like self-government, exclusion rights and so on, are essentially joint rights based, at least in part, on membership of a social group or institution. So I suggest that the notion I introduced earlier of joint rights that are based, at least in part, on membership of some social group or an institution or structure of institutions. But they are what's often referred to as collective rights. And in particular, there are some of these some people talk about collective rights when they've got in mind especially minority rights. Like, for example, in the Australian context, the Aboriginal people have a particular set of minority rights with respect to land, with respect to various rights to fish and this and that other groups don't have. Now, what I suggest is actually going on there is that these are essentially collective rights, they're joint rights based on membership of a particular group. And so you can have, within a particular polity, you can have different structures of joint rights. You can have these minority rights, for example, albeit there are collective rights that all the members of that community have jointly, if it's to be regarded as a political community. Okay, so how are we travelling? Good. Vast amounts of time.
14 minutes.
Oh, 14. Good. Okay, so what have I done so far? I've said a few things about my project in relation to joint action and the extension of that notion. I've put on the table this notion of joint rights, which are individual relational rights, and concomitant obligations. So we now have joint rights and joint obligations. I hope I can see, by the way people are yawning, that this is clearly being well received. I don't see anyone getting sort of excited in a manner which would indicate that they're rejecting this important concept that I've introduced. So I'll proceed on now to see if I can apply it in the political sphere. So I'm basically going to talk about, in a general sense, political participation, and then I'm going to talk about a particular institutional embodiment of political participation, namely voting. And I'm going to do so through the lens of joint rights and joint obligations. Okay, so let me think of political participation in a general sense as doing things like vote, stand for office, engaging public political discussion, organising political parties, joint assemblies, and so on and so forth. But also not just participating in that sense. The notion of participation that I have in mind is also one in which people accept the results of these processes. So when someone is elected as the leader, they obey the directives of that leader. If laws have been legislated or policies made, they go along with those laws, not simply because they think the action that the law requires is independently warranted, but because in fact that's the law and they feel they should comply with it. I regard all these things as modes of political participation. So it's not just that you have rights to rush around and do things, you also have obligations in terms of accepting outcomes of elections and accepting legislation and so on and so forth. So let's just in a fairly broad but messy sense call that political participation. So what I would suggest is that the moral right and obligation of individual citizens to participate in this general sense in the political decision-making process and accept the results of legitimate political processes in the polity of which they are members is a joint moral right and obligation. So I'm going to just throw this on the table and suggest to you that at the bottom, political participation in this general sense is a joint right and a joint obligation. So you can all go home now. I've applied my concept. Okay, so let me say a little bit more about this because I think that the joint rights and obligation of political participation, and I'm talking here about moral rights and moral obligations, which may be embodied in different ways in different institutional arrangements, is interestingly different from some of the other joint rights and obligations that are constitutive of other institutions. And this is because I think one way to think about political institutions as opposed to economic institutions or institutions of learning or hospitals or whatever is that is that political institutions are a kind of meta-institution. They're a kind of institution which has as its point purpose, in my parlance, collective end, the structuring and the revising and the coordinating and the maintaining of other institutions. So that certainly in contemporary societies, the government is spending a great deal of time putting in place policies, implementing, generating legislation, and so on, with respect to the market institution, or with respect to policy with respect to pensions, or with respect to education, or and so on and so forth. So I think one way to think of government in the contemporary setting is as a meta-institution. If anything like that is right, and if I'm right about, and if one accepts the sort of fairly woolly, admittedly fairly woolly notion of political participation, then what we've got is a joint moral right and moral obligation of political participation is in effect a meta-normative structure, given what I've just said about the nature of the relationship between political institutions and other institutions. And the joint moral right and moral obligation of political participation is based on, I suggest, three things. First of all, and this now becomes an instance in which a joint right and joint obligations are based on individual rights and possibly individual obligations. So it's based in part on the individual natural right of autonomy. So here we have a joint right based on an individual right and indeed a natural right, let's assume. Secondly, the joint moral right and moral obligation of political participation, let's say in Australia or in Italy, is based on membership of the particular polity in question. So it's important to see that this joint right and moral obligation is relativised to particular polities. In the contemporary setting, typically nation states, and membership of the polity is a kind of a difficult notion, but presumably it's because one lives in it, occupies particular institutional roles in that polity, contributes to and benefits from other institutions in that polity, and so on. But thirdly, and this is where we come back to this meta notion, the overarching meta-collective end, and therefore in this context meta-collective good, of the coordinated continuation and revision of all of this lower order joint activity and production of collective goods in these other institutions of learning institutions, economic institutions producing of goods, which are constitutive of the common life, for members of that community and their common institutions. That's the other basis for this joint moral right and moral obligation of political participation. So I'm positing joint moral right and moral obligation of political participation, and I'm suggesting it's got a threefold basis. One, individual autonomy. Two, membership of particular polity, in a strong sense of membership. But three, that the institutions, the political institutions, have as their overall collective end indeed a collective good, so that in this instance the joint rights, the joint moral right and moral obligation of political participation is partly based on individual rights, in particular autonomy, but it's also partly based on the good that political participation generates. And the good in question, of course, is coordination, continuation, revision of all these other institutions. Terrific. You'll be pleased to know that I will finish well ahead of time. This is my last slide. Thank you. Okay, so in this final slide, so I've offered a general, as it were, take on political participation in my broad sense as a joint moral right and moral obligation with a three-way basis: individual autonomy, membership in the relevant polity, and thirdly, the collective good generated by political participation. But let me take now a specific institutional embodiment of political participation. I mean, people think of political participation, they often think in terms of simply the right to vote. So let me crank through this particular institutional mode of political participation and see how it kind of looks. So on this kind of view, a citizen A has a moral right, oh, by the way, and an obligation to vote. This is a moral right and a moral obligation to vote. Now, in many jurisdictions, of course, with a right to vote, you don't have an obligation to vote. In Australia, by contrast, you actually have a legal obligation to vote. At any rate, my assertion at this point is that, morally speaking, people do have a moral right and an obligation to vote in an election jointly with, so person A has a moral right and obligation to vote in an election jointly with B and C, whereas other individuals, D, E and F, who don't belong to that polity, don't have any such right or obligation jointly or otherwise. Secondly, individual A's right obligation to vote is interdependent with B and C having this right and obligation. So there's interdependence. But thirdly, and this is what differentiates joint rights and obligations from various other sorts of conditional rights and obligations, this interdependence of individual rights and obligation to vote, I suggest, derives in part from the collective end, which is also a collective good, and therefore these are not merely reciprocal individual rights and obligations. So it derives from this joint right to vote and obligation to vote derives in part from the collective good. What's the collective good in the case of voting? Well, I suggest it's something like the fact that jointly generated by the voting mechanism and jointly accepted, we don't just vote, but we accept the outcome of the vote, and therefore ceteris paribus, a morally legitimate political leader or particular policy, depending on what's being voted on. So I suggest that is the collective good, which underpins and provides, in part, the basis for the right to vote. So in the case of the right to vote, it's a joint right and a joint obligation. First point. Secondly, it's in part based on the fact that of your individual autonomy. Secondly, it's based on the fact that you're a member in the strong sense of that particular political community, which is why you have that right jointly with others in that community. And thirdly, it's also in part derived from the collective good, which is produced or generated by that particular voting system. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very clear and interesting presentation, and thank you also for saving 5 minutes of your time. So we have perhaps some more minutes for questions, and the first one is here.
Yeah, my concern is I probably should study this, work on it, and then email you, but I can't resist the opportunity to make a mess of this. My concern is, what do we gain by rights talk? And I speak on behalf of people who have been seriously let down by political institutions that don't function for various reasons, because of the World Trade Organization undermining parliamentary authority. Go ahead, have a law, but don't implement it. So we're looking at a global arena where not all nation states have equal capacity to fulfill their democratic or political remits. So, I mean, to make a long story short, it looks to me like the derivative relationship is in the reverse, so that in my good United States and your wonderful Australia, some of the people, most of the time, can enjoy these rights. But that's because we have strong, stable institutions that nobody fucks with, excuse my American English. But where I live now, people don't enjoy these rights at all because the democratic structures are very weak, and whenever they gain strength, they're undermined by outside forces that have a particular investment, financial and otherwise, in undermining people's autonomy. And also, these are places where the institutions don't generate a collective good by political participation. I mean, Milan Kundera writes about being forced to vote, or that's very old. But look now at what goes on in Hong Kong. Everybody has a right to vote, but a particular party in China decides who they can vote for. So if you have the pretense of these institutions, then the rights don't play out. So I guess on a theoretical level, it looks to me like within a very narrow political framework and background in history, you can talk about rights, but the actual reality on the ground is unless the Constitution is already there and unless the global environment allows it to be implemented, the rights is just nice literature. Okay, so what do you do with me except throw me against the wall?
You've got a right not to be assaulted. I think I made that clear in one of the earlier. Well, the first thing is that the rights, the moral, I'm a believer in moral rights and collective goods as having some sort of objective character. So the mere fact that some individuals, organisation, or indeed whole polities don't respect those rights is so much for the worse for them, morally speaking. Similarly, the point about collective goods. So when I say collective goods, I mean collective goods. I mean, of course, there are many organisations which don't produce collective goods. They produce, for want of a better word, collective bads. The mafia springs to mind, I'm sorry, as a sophisticated institution, but a sophisticated organisation, but it's not producing a collective good by and large. Similarly, in Australia, we've had a long history of the moral rights, as I would see it, of the Indigenous people being violated by the organisational arrangements. But that seems to me to be simply the challenge of bringing into existence collective institutions, in particular institutions that realise collective goods. This seems to me to be a matter of designing and establishing the relevant institutions, namely those ones that will produce collective goods to which people will have joint rights. And so we won't have the sort of problems that, of course, we currently have. You know, that's really the thrust of my response. I don't think your objection really is to the point in terms of the theory that I'm offering.
I guess what I'm suggesting, let me give it one more crack.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe I shouldn't.
Yeah.
How is it that I shouldn't just understand rights talk as an ellipsis for adequate institutional and structural arrangements which allow people what they ought to be legally entitled to if such exists? I mean, you talk about the legal rights of corporations as individual rights, and that just seems to me to you're talking about rights there of an individual, which is a collective group entity.
But that's a merely institutional right. I mean, corporations clearly have legal rights, and some of those rights are legal. Some of those legal rights are individual rights because it's the right that Exxon might have to do X, Y, and Z. But I mean, it's a far cry from that to suggest that Exxon has moral rights. Okay. So as I said at the beginning, I think I like to be fairly permissive about institutional rights and obligations, but not about moral rights and obligations. And clearly, institutional rights and obligations ought to some extent, not I think completely, but ought to some extent track prior moral rights and obligations, which of course they don't do. But, you know, this is the world we live in. I don't think we want to, the fact that there are all these very bad things happening, the fact that there are a whole lot of people having their rights violated, the fact that there are a whole lot of organisations that aren't actually producing collective goods but are feathering the nest of particular individuals or whatever, is not a good reason, I suggest, for giving up on the idea of collective goods and moral rights. It's actually the reverse. It's a very good reason for insisting on them and attempting to restructure institutions in a way that such that they realise collective goods and respect rights.
Okay, thank you. One more over there. Over there.
Yeah, so I have a clarificatory question about the notion of a joint right. So you made the point that joint rights are not conditional rights, but they are relational.
Not merely
Not merely conditional.
Yeah.
Okay, so they are relational, but they're individual rights, and that they're held by individuals, but qua members in some collectivity or in some joint activity or enterprise or process or whatever it is. So I wonder what would be lost if we just spoke of individual rights that are grounded in something collective. So is there anything about the formal structure of joint rights that is different from the formal structure of individual rights? So does the jointness pertain to the formal structure of those rights, or merely to the grounds from which those rights derive?
Well, I think it's both. Is a short answer, because I can't see any way of offering it. I mean, remember that by definition, we need to get just sort of clear. By definition, an individual right is a right that one might possess by virtue of properties that one has as an individual, full stop. Right. So we would obviously, since an aggregate of such rights doesn't get you to a joint right, it can't be. We do need the notion of a joint right if that's. But the second point is that, so you might, leaving aside the question about the basis of the rights, okay, but the second point is that I said, okay, well, let's say we might be able to, as I suggested, complicate the notion of individual right by building in certain kinds of interdependence, such as, for example, conditionality on some external condition. That's not going to be helpful in this context, because you have to have the individuals jointly, as opposed to some individual having the right conditional on something else. So then I suggested, well, what about, I mean, the obvious kind of notion would then be reciprocal rights. Okay, so they are rights that I might have conditional and you have a conditional and I have, might be brought into existence. But what I was suggesting there is that they're not going to quite cut it either. Of course, I don't have any, if someone wants to say that reciprocal individual rights are joint rights, then that's fine, but they're not going to cut it quite to the extent that I require, because remember, I'm going to then say, oh, hang on, there's got to be some collective good in play. Now, it may be that if someone wants, I mean, it could be just a sort of stipulative exercise where you say, clearly joint rights are not merely individual rights, or not merely individual rights that have some condition. But you might say, well, joint rights are simply rights in which there's interdependence between the possessors of the right. Okay, and that's certainly a necessary condition in my view for joint rights. But what I wanted to say was that, properly speaking, joint rights go beyond that because they presuppose a collective good. Now, if you want to say, oh, well, there's two species of joint rights. There's the ones that are interdependent, and then there's the ones that, in addition to the interdependence, bring with it the collective good. Well, that's fine. In that case, I mean, that's just a terminological point.
Okay. Francesca. Short, please.
Yes, very short. What makes you particularly vulnerable to lower style objections, I reckon?
To whose objection?
Lower style.
Uh-huh.
Lower style objections.
Good
and
evidence.
which lends a slightly Hegelian flavor to your whole theory. I don't think this is a compliment. Is that in the last item of your last slide, you mentioned, if I remember well, the elected leader as a supreme common good. No matter
Not
how
supreme.
much the blessing. Well, but a
Not
good,
supreme.
not an evil, not an evil.
Sorry?
Not in that, well, maybe not supreme. I'm sort
I hope
of
not
adding,
supreme, no.
adding something to it. In any event, a good and not an evil, not a public evil. No matter how mixed this blessing can be for the people concerned.
Well, let's go to the last.
This
Let's go to the
election-
last slide, just to make sure we've got the. I have got a ceteris paribus in there, haven't I?
What does it mean in this case?
Other things being equal.
Well, but you presuppose.
If it's so that not any old leader will do the job.
Yeah, but you presuppose that he's a good guy after all. It's not just that he's been legitimately elected, but he has to be a good guy, not mess the whole thing up. Right?
Well, yeah. Well, my view would be that if it remains that if it's a collective good. Of course, there's this collective good, and this collective good could be even better. but this collective good, it could be even better. But insofar as it was jointly generated by electoral process and jointly accepted, that is, we sort of, it seems to me that that is a collective good, ceteris paribus, because of course other things may not be. We may be into something wrong. But I agree that I think it's a fair point to say, and you might. And I don't necessarily disagree with this. So you might, I've put morally legitimate. Okay. So I think that jointly generated and jointly accepted is a collective good. But I think what you might, ceteris paribus, but I think what you might say, which I'm quite sympathetic to, is you might say, sorry, you still fall short of moral legitimacy. In other words, it's a good, but it's not good enough, right? And so you might say, in order to get you over the hurdle of moral legitimacy, you've got to have more than that, and the leader in question has to pursue the common good of blah, 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 right? And I'd be quite sympathetic to that. I think that's may well be right, but that will simply cause me to remove the morally legitimate, but stay with the notion of a ceteris paribus collective good.
Okay, Francesco De Vecchio.
So, thank you very much for this rights taxonomy you provided. And so my question is maybe first clarification questions. Do you distinguish it, as also Christian asked, between among individual rights, first of all, and you said the joint rights are relational individual rights.
Right.
And then also you distinguish, you identified another kind, joint rights, and then collective rights. So my first question is, if you can come back to distinction on the distinction between joint rights and collective
Yes.
rights on the one hand.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I was wondering if this taxonomy could be also enriched by also looking at the correlative part of rights, as Margaret mentioned often, in this talk. We know that each right is a right because there is a counterpart that has an obligation with respect to someone who has a right. And so,
Okay.
so the question is if we can also apply this distinction, individual, collective, and joint, about regarding this part of obligation, of correlating
the short answer,
obligation.
there's a very short answer to that. I mean, I thought I had got, the paper's called Joint Moral Rights and Obligations, so obviously, yeah, I mean, maybe in some of the discussion I tended to focus on rights, but of course, most of these rights, and in fact, certainly I was quite explicit, the political participation has correlative obligations, which will be joint obligations. So that part of what you're saying is absolutely right. The story I've got is about joint rights and joint obligations. Okay. So that part of your question is, the answer is quite clear, I think. On the earlier point, again, this is partly a kind of stipulative thing. It just seems to me that a lot of the discussion about group rights, collective rights, I guess it's died away a bit in recent times, but it seemed to me that really a lot of that stuff was about effectively minority rights, and essentially the minority rights in questions were essentially joint rights. That's the first point, but joint rights based in part on membership of a particular social group, whatever. In other words, so not all joint rights are based on membership of such a group. Obviously, the people who write the book and have a joint right to the author, they don't have to be members of a. The right is based on their joint production. It's not based on their membership. Whereas in the case of these other, what are typically referred to as collective rights, group rights, they are typically joint rights in my view, but ones that happen to be based in part on membership of some community. And so that was all I meant. It's a kind of, let's label that particular species of joint right collective rights, because I think it kind of gels with what people have had in mind. But bearing in mind, but the other point I was trying to make is that a lot of those minority rights are just, a lot of the rights that we have, leaving aside minority rights, are just joint rights by virtue of membership of the community. And what's really going on with the minority rights is trying to live with the fact that there are two separate groups with somewhat different histories, and one's disadvantaged and so on and so forth. So you're giving a slightly different and typically additional set of collective rights to that group. Of course, it doesn't mean that they don't enjoy the collective rights that everyone in the group in the nation state has.
So I just want to thank you. I thought that was a good talk. What I want to ask is basically a clarificatory question. At the end, you say jointly generated and jointly accepted, and I'm wondering what work the word generated is doing there.
This is in the voting case, right?
Yeah, in the voting case. Yeah, I understood it when we were talking about pie and,
right,
the different goods that different people were generating. But moral legitimacy or justice or whatever you're getting at the end here seems like a more traditional collective good, like the type of good that I can't enjoy unless we all enjoy it.
Right.
So I'm just wondering.
Right, yeah. Well, look, yes, maybe generated is an unfortunate term. I guess it's basically the idea is that we want to end up with we've got a problem. We've got to live together and we've got to move on together and so on and so forth. And we need a leader, let's say, or a government. I mean, I don't mean to focus on an individual. Or we need a particular decision-making process with respect to laws or policies or whatever it is. So essentially, all I'm saying is that jointly generated just means if we take the particular mechanism that we use, some voting mechanism, jointly generated just means that we all vote, right? That's the input, and then the mechanism cranks out a result, majority with, whatever it happens to be, preferentials, whatever the system is, cranks out a result. So that's the joint generation. But I think it's important then to see that has to be jointly accepted. So we got to live with the result even if we didn't like it. So that, I didn't mean anything more than that. Maybe the term generated is not helpful in this context.
Okay. One more, two more questions, but you have to be very brief. Thank you.
So, as I understand it, based on what you said, you want to resist the idea that a group of people can have a right as a group.
A moral right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so you
Happy with them having an institutional right. Yeah.
okay, they can have moral rights. So you define a collective right as rights that individual group members have in virtue of being a member of that group.
Jointly.
Jointly.
Yeah.
So,
In part by virtue of membership. Yeah.
okay. So, and one of the examples you gave is the right of Australians to exclude people from the territory. of
Assuming that is a right.
Okay. So I guess I just thought that was an interesting case, the right to exclude, because I'm just kind of imagining. Suppose that one day you're walking along the beach in Australia and a boat of immigrants comes up.
Right.
You know, would you say that you kind of, if no one else is around, you can just kind of push that boat out to sea and claim that that's your right as an Australian? And if not, I guess I would ask, in what sense then is that a right that you have personally, rather than a right of the Australian people?
Well, the answer to your question is no. I don't think I have an individual right. If that means I have a right independently of the other members of the Australian community to exclude that particular boat. Of course, if I have a joint right, I have an individual right interdependently with others. Then in this particular instance, I may have a right, full stop, to prevent this particular boat coming in. But that would just be the exercise of my joint right. That's all.
So if I can kind of follow up on that briefly,
Yes, very briefly.
just for
Thank you.
clarification.
Yeah.
Are you saying that if it's a joint right, that your exercise of that right is in some sense conditional on the agreement or kind of approval of other people that you share that joint right with?
Oh, okay. So that's a tricky question. Someone might say, there's two. I think there's two. The distinction has to be made there. So remember, the right to exclude, which I'm saying is a joint right, is consistent with deciding to waive it in particular cases, right? And it may even be that there are certain categories of people, for example, refugees, that you don't actually have a joint right to exclude, even though you've got a general joint right to exclude. So that'd be one issue. But I think it'd be it seems to me that you'd be, at least this is an argument I think a lot of people would find persuasive. If the Australian people jointly decided to waive their right to exclude, that would be a pretty big step in terms of continuing as a nation state, because some people might say, well, actually the right to exclude, the joint right to exclude from this territory is actually in part constitutive of what it is to be a nation state. So I think that would be a big step if they took that decision, if indeed they would be entitled to take it, because of course it'd only be the current generations of Australians that would. So maybe someone would say, well, hang on, that's a step too far. That's yeah.
We have the last question.
Oh, well, big responsibility. I must be very quick. So just a small curiosity about your notion of common goods.
Collective good.
Collective goods. Right, that was the point. Is that have you got a notion of common good as opposed to collective good? And would there be a different relative to public goods?
Right.
So this three.
Yeah. Look, that's a really good, quick question to which there's an enormously lengthy answer because of course there's a whole lot of stuff about public goods in the economic sense versus blah 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 blah. I had hoped to avoid that issue, but yeah, you put your finger on a big sort of issue, which I haven't really said anything of any consequence about here.
Okay, thank you again.
We finished for today. I have to